Hello, and welcome to this video panel by the Center for Geopolitics. My name is Philip Hirsch. I'm a PhD student and I'm also with the Center for Geopolitics here at Cambridge. Last week, we discussed conflict in the Middle East, and today I'm very excited to chair the second video panel on the region, this time focusing on the question of foreign intervention in Middle Eastern geopolitics. For several years now, the Center for Geopolitics has engaged with the Middle East through our Westphalia for the Middle East project. When preparing for today's discussion, I was remembered of a debate we had last year with a European diplomat. In the interest of Chatham House rules, I won't go into detail who he was, but when we talked about the role of foreign powers in the Middle East, he said something interesting. For the Europeans, when it comes to intervening in the Middle East, you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. And indeed, this sums up the debate on the topic quite well, I think, at least in Europe. On the one hand, you have examples such as the 2003 Iraq War, or the 2011 intervention in Libya, which are broadly considered triggers for more chaos and instability in the region. On the other hand, there has been a lot of criticism from many sides as to Europe's inactivity in standing by in the Syrian civil war. Wherever you stay on this debate, I think it is safe to say that foreign intervention in the Middle East is a complicated topic. To make sense of it a bit more, we have brought together 4 experts with great insight on the region. Nikolai Kozanov is an associate research professor at Qatar University and a consulting fellow at Chatham House. Ambassador Hasham Youssef has had a distinguished career in the Egyptian Foreign Service and is currently affiliated with the US Institute for Peace, although tonight he will talk in his personal capacity and not on behalf of Youssef. Ronan Bergman is an author and a journalist for the New York Times based in Israel, and indeed he also is a PhD graduate from Cambridge. And finally, we have with us John Svakianakis, currently affiliated with Chatham House and the Gulf Research Center after a career as an economist in Saudi Arabia. Already now, I want to thank them for joining this video panel. It is great to have you with us tonight. Together, we will tackle questions about what sort of interventions in the Middle East we can observe, such as military or economic ones. We will also cover different international and regional actors intervening, and certainly also come back to the question of the outcome of interventions. But as usual, before entering our discussion, I want to make some quick technical remarks. We will start the event with some introductory comments by our panelists before moving on to a broader discussion. Throughout the discussion, I want to encourage you, the audience, to ask questions to the panelists. You can do this by using the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. When you ask questions, please start by writing your name and your affiliation first. If your question is for a specific panelist, please make sure to state that at the outset as well. We have a big audience today, which is great, but it also means we might have a lot of questions. I hope to get through as many of them as possible, but I already want to apologize now if I can't address all of them. Finally, I also want to mention that as usual, this event is being recorded and we will post a recording on our website over the next few days. And this will be all from me for the moment. And I now ask Nikolai Kozanov to give us his introductory comments.
Thank you very much, Philip, for your introduction. And I would also like to thank the Center for Geopolitics for this opportunity to join you this evening, unfortunately via Skype, not in person, and to share my views on the issue. To kick out the discussion, I would like to say that definitely Russian intervention in the Middle East represents a very interesting case. And the uniqueness of this case is determined by the fact that on the one hand, we deal with a country which has a global ambitions and that would like to play the role of a global player. But on the other hand, the capacities of this country is very limited. And as a result, this determines at least 2 very interesting characteristics of Russian intervention and Russian presence in the region. On the one hand, Russia's interest in the Middle East, they are determined not only by the region itself, but also by Moscow relations with the non-regional players, first and foremost with the US and with the European Union. On the other hand, Moscow has to be inventive to reach its goals. It has to punch far above its weight, and that's why the Russian intervention in the region it always has a hybrid form. So one which is mixing, uniting on the one hand the use of military measures, and on the other hand the use of diplomatic, soft power, economic measures as well. And moreover, depending on the situation, Russia has to balance between the use of different type of involvement, intervention, ways, instruments to affect the situation in the region and to reach its goals and targets there. From this point of view, Russian intervention in Libya and Syria, they are a very notorious and bright example of the use of these hybrid tactics. However, right now, Moscow is experiencing a number of serious challenges that might compel it to change its accents in the use of different assets in the Middle East. These challenges can be summarized in three groups. First of all, it's domestic issues that are making Moscow to get more focused on the domestic political dynamics and decrease a number of challenges it needs to deal with outside at the foreign policy field. Secondly, it is definitely the coronavirus, which created a lot of economic problems, which depleted, together with the fall in oil prices, Russian financial resources, Russia's assets it can accumulate and invest in its presence in the region. And finally, it's also the growing questions to Russia from the region itself, whether actually Moscow can play the role of an important, of a great power in this region while possessing a very limited resources. So as a result, we will see a certain readjustment in the Russian approaches to the region, and they already started to be implemented. So what we will see, Moscow will probably become more active, but these activities will be focused on the preserving its gains rather than at the gaining of new areas of influence, of new positions in the region. Secondly, the actions of Moscow will become, I would say, rather less risky, or at least Moscow will try to minimize its risks. But at the same time, it will also try to balance the cost of its efforts. So what we will see in the end, Moscow to be more active diplomatically, getting more actively involved in the international initiatives in the region, but rather downgrading its military presence or attempt to use the force. And that's what have already happened on the one hand in Libya, and also partly happening in Syria, where Moscow is trying to be less supportive of the efforts of the Syrian regime to continue its military operations in the country. So that's where I would probably like to stop, to use my 5 minutes, and give the floors for the Q&A, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I will save my questions for later, for the moment, I think, and just move on straight to Ambassador Youssef.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with the other fellow panelists. Let me start by saying that historically, the Middle East has been a magnet for attracting intervention coming from different places around the world. And this has been historic, from the British, the French, the Italians, and before that, the Ottoman Empire, and more recently, during the Cold War, the rivalry between the US and Russia, and then until today. I'll be talking mainly about the four main powers in the world as briefly as I can: the US, Russia, the EU, and China. And since Russia was covered by Nikolai, I'll be very brief as well. The US intervention in the region was quite significant in recent history, both on the positive side and on the negative side, and on issues that go between both of them. On the positive side, there was the liberation of Kuwait that could not have happened without the intervention of the United States. Peace between Israel and both Egypt and Jordan that could not have happened without the United States. The war against ISIS that also required US intervention. So that's on the positive side. On the negative side, we have the 2003 war in Iraq that you mentioned at the outset of this session. We also have the deal of the century that may have implications on stability in the region. And then there are issues that are quite difficult and controversial, because like the nuclear deal with Iran, that was seen in a positive sense, but then it had some shortcomings, and then the US withdrew, and so on. So it's a much more complicated issue that the time does not allow to go into details about it. But then there is a debate now, both in the region and in the US, about the withdrawal of the US from the region. And I think this is much easier said than done. People are arguing, well, the US would like to withdraw, it doesn't need any oil from the region is not as important as it once was, there is the superpower competition and so on. But then it is very difficult because the US has huge interests in the region, whether it's in relation to developments pertaining to Iran, whether it's its relations with Israel, relations with the Gulf. And so it has huge interests that cannot be addressed without US presence. And it's interesting because when Iraq was debating ending US presence there, President Trump promised severe and unprecedented sanctions on Iraq if they request the US to leave Iraq. So it's a very mixed picture in relation to leaving the region or not. But at the same time, we can also say that the role of the US in a large number of conflicts, whether it's Libya, Syria, or Yemen, is not that consequential. So it's a very complicated story in relation to this issue. Coming to Russia, just to complement what was mentioned by Nikolai, I just say a few points. The first point is that Russia was absent from the region until the Arab revolutions, and it came back to the region through the Syrian Gate. And I think this allowed Russia to come back in a strong way. And just to add one or two more points. The first point is that Russia has a huge advantage as compared to the US because Russia speaks to everybody. It speaks to Hezbollah, it speaks to Hamas, it speaks to the Syrian regime, it speaks to Iran, while the US is not capable of also communicating with a number of players that have a role in many conflicts. And the second point is that I think that despite the limited capacity of Russia, it is still playing a weak hand in rather well. But at the end of the day, I think Russia in general has been trying to challenge the post-Cold War security order. And you just need to look at Crimea to see how this is taking place. And also in its return to the Middle East as well, it is challenging the post-Cold War arrangements and so on. The EU, after decades of impressive achievements through integration and growth, and it started raising the slogan, we want to be a player and not a payer. Unfortunately, they were only making this a slogan. They didn't put pressure to bear in different places around the world in order for this to take place. And now the EU is suffering from the wounds of Brexit as well as the pandemic. So it remains to be seen how the European Union would recover from all these problems, because it is a huge challenge and it is not clear whether they will be successful or not. Finally, on China, I think China is also becoming more active and more aggressive at the international level. We just need to look at the Belt and Road Initiative that has 68 countries with $160 billion, and the ambitions of China. Of course, China does not want to step on anybody's foot at this point in time because they don't feel that they are ready to become a political player that is on par with the United States at this point in time. But it will be forced to play a more active role in order to preserve its interests, whether it's in relation to markets or in relation to its need for natural resources. And there will be friction and points of differences in different areas, whether it's the Middle East, Africa, or otherwise. So we will see, and of course it has become a more important issue, the issue that is being discussed in different circles around the world about a great power competition and how this would evolve and the implications of that on international relations and developments, including in the Middle East. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. And we'll go straight to Tel Aviv, I think, and to Ronan.
Hi, and thank you for the invitation. Sorry for being a little bit busy, during which, the news is chasing us all the time. And there has been just a few hours ago, massive explosion in one of the biggest, if not the biggest, Iranian enrichment facilities. nuclear enrichment facilities in something that is a developing news story, and I'm sure that we are going to hear much more about this in the coming hours. I'm not sure it's an accident. And also, you know, if it was indeed the sabotage, then it relates directly to what we are speaking about, intervention in the Middle East. You said that we have just few minutes, so maybe I'll have 2 minutes on annexation and 2 minutes on what Israel is doing in Syria, partly in Iraq and in Lebanon. So the world stood ready for Israel making the move, following what seems to be a series of right-wing, if not ultra-right-wing positions and steps taken by the Israeli government, by the Benjamin Netanyahu policy in the recent years, supported by the Trump administration, the declaration of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel by the US, the annexation or the acceptance of annexation by US government, the moving of relocation of the embassy to Jerusalem, and then the Trump plan, which as part of it had the annexation of parts of the West Bank. I think that most people involved and most people looking at the region thought that if Benjamin Netanyahu says that he's going to annex parts of the West Bank, he will indeed do that. It was supposed to happen yesterday, nothing happened. And today, still nothing happened. And the presence of that event in the speeches of Benjamin Netanyahu has been decreased to 0 in the last 2 weeks, and now it's just not there. And it seems that it's either going to be a very small, just for the sake of symbolic annexation, or not happening at all. I think that Benjamin Netanyahu realized that on one hand, he has his ironclad rule from losing his first government to Ehud Barak in 1998, that you never leave your base of power. And his base of power are the right-wing settlers, the ultra-right-wingers. He's not going to leave them. But he also understands that by having this step, this policy executed, the annexation, this might be one step too much. He faced a severe opposition from Europe, including Germany, which is considered to be I would say a consistent supporter of Israel, and Germany has made a very clear stand on this issue. He has strong opposition at home. Israel is in severe economic crisis because of COVID-19, and people says, well, we don't have salaries, we don't have food to bring to our houses, and this is what the government is dealing with. So I think Benjamin Netanyahu realized that while he thought it's going to be his last chance under the current Trump administration, while not knowing if Trump is going to be re-elected, he might be better off if he just leave that aside for the time being and go back to deal with the more current and more important issues that Israel is dealing with. Now, when speaking about what Israel is doing in Syria and in Lebanon and to some extent in Iraq, Israel is a very, I would say, Israeli-centric, or following a very Israeli-centric policy. It's usually judged by whether something is good or bad for Israel. Is it good or bad for the Jews? And what Israel is trying to do in what is termed as the war between the wars, so the low intensity conflict that Israel has been engaged in Syria since 2014, is to make sure that Iran would not continue its military buildup in the region in order to build another front against Israel. So Israel is trying to, while bombing Iranian bunkers, Iranian stashes of arms, Iranian convoys going from Iran to Iraq to Syria to Lebanon to arm Hezbollah, bombing Hezbollah in Syria. Israel has done that many, many times with much success based on intelligence, nothing less than exquisite, that Mossad and military intelligence supplied the Israeli Defense Forces and Israeli Air Force. While doing that, it also remained strategic, I would say, limits. not bombing Hezbollah, almost not bombing Hezbollah at all in Lebanon, not killing Hezbollah operatives. Israel has refrained from killing Hezbollah operatives. It had no problem with killing Iranian operatives, but they knew that if they kill Hezbollah operatives, this Hezbollah will retaliate, and this could deteriorate into an all-out war, which is the one thing that Israel is trying to make sure that would not happen. So the Israeli policy is that follows the rules of if Israel is able to maintain only a very, very low level military Iranian presence in Syria and stop at least most of the routes of supply from Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and stop what the Hezbollah is called the precision project, which is trying to arm their rockets and missiles in a much better guidance systems. If Israel could do that, it would not kill everybody. It would not explode everybody. It will remain on a low-level intensity conflict and do whatever it can to refrain from a total conflict between the sides, while knowing that there will be a day when an all-out war will break in the region. They even have a name for this new war, the next war. They're calling it in Mossad the first Northern War. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon for the first Lebanon War. 2006, another conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, the second Lebanon War. And the next one, God forbid, I hope it will never start, but the next one, if start, will be called the first Northern War, because it's going to be Israel on one side and cross-border Hezbollah, Iran, Syria against Israel from both Lebanon and Syria at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you. That's fascinating, and also I think I already can hear a theme here, which is that we seem to talk a lot about low-level indirect interventionism. You know, sort of how you say trying to be active in Syria from an Israeli side without sort of stirring up the nest too much. The same as Russia is in a way doing. They want to be at the table, but they don't want to completely, you know, they don't want to transform Syria. It's a very different paradigm from what we had 10, 20 years ago when it was about transforming societies. And I guess even today, the Americans are quite indirect in many ways if you look at drone warfare and their engagement in the region, which is, I think, an interesting intervention paradigm we increasingly see in the Middle East. I'll definitely come back on a few of the things that you said that I found very interesting. But before that, I want to give John the chance to make his introductory statement.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you very much for the invitation. Well, it seems that chaos and uncertainty defines in many ways the Middle East. And as the economist in the group, I would say that economically speaking, the region has not fared very well. And with COVID, a double or triple whammy has taken place, both for the oil exporting countries and the oil importing countries. For the Gulf Arab states, it is a challenging moment because they have not really diversified away from oil. The attempt is there. Different visions have been presented over the last several years by all of the Gulf oil producing countries. And now they're found to be in a situation where COVID is a generalized output crisis for the global economy. And the other day we were told that the IMF is predicting $12 trillion of output to be taken out from the global economy. So in many ways, the Gulf oil exporters are not insulated from all of this. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar are all facing difficulties, and more so Bahrain and Oman, which are in a more difficult situation because their oil resources are quickly dwindling. And in this situation, they have to find out alternative solutions, and they're not really quickly to be found. For the oil importing nations, such as the North African countries, in that I include Egypt, Tunisia, of course, Morocco, but also the Levant, we find a different sort of crisis, which is that a lot of the laborers who went to work in the Gulf region are now returning back home. And remittances have played a very important role for all of the countries, whether you look at Lebanon or even ostensibly Syria today in this chaotic situation of having a half a nation, or Egypt and further afield in Morocco and Tunisia as well. So this is a very difficult crisis because also let's say the Arab world has not been able to create a successful economic model. Many of the times of reform included sorts of crony capitalism. At times it was kleptocratic. If you look at some of the countries of the Levant, today's crisis in Lebanon is really as a result of these practices of corruption, a very difficult systemic endemic problem that faces not just Lebanon, but many other countries in the wider Middle East. So the intervention, when you look at the Middle East, many observers, but also investors take the back seat when they want to invest in this region because they are beholden and faced with these critical aspects that my colleagues just explained, which is the political uncertainty. The politics is very dicey. And if you include the economics, it either favors the few or without the connectivity and the networking that is required, you will never be able to do fruitful business at a level playing field. So today, the Middle East, in terms of their economies, they look very uncertain. Again, maybe a cliche, very chaotic. They have been unable to produce the vestiges of development over the last 20 years. They have all trying to reform, but now it's difficult. And when you look at the Gulf countries, now the only thing that they had is oil, and that oil fell in terms of pricing. And we're told that the US is a major, if not a more important producer. So in the 5 coming years, many of these countries will face a much more challenging situation that they faced 5 years ago. That's all I wanted to say from my side. Thank you.
Thank you. And I mean, that's of course also a massive issue, not only for the oil-producing countries, but also for the many of the other Arab countries who have workers in the oil-producing countries and who then will not be able to send remittances back home anymore. So that would, if you're right, John, of course, that would be a massive repercussion on the region. I already have started to get questions from the audience, which is great. And I think the first one might actually be quite a good follow-up to you, John. It is about Lebanon. And Nadia El-Mawala, she asks about the economic crisis in Lebanon. And she says it's hard to see how this could be resolved without foreign aid or foreign support, financial support. But of course, for political reasons, the USA are not going to support a government in which the Hezbollah is involved in. I was just wondering, I mean, do you think in a situation like in Lebanon, is it possible to resolve the financial and economic crisis there without significant foreign support, or under what conditions it might come, in particular from the US or Europe?
Right. No, thank you very much. I think that the Lebanon crisis will not be solved unless the politics is solved, because primarily the crisis in Lebanon is a political one. Nobody will be involved in sorting out unless the structural impediments created by the political elite is resolved. And what is interesting in all of this is that none of the Gulf past supporters of Lebanon, the financial supporters, predominantly the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and from time to time Kuwait, are not willing to put a hand in the pocket to support them, because they know very well that this will be money burned and thrown out. And the international community will only step in if there is conditionality and if there are real structural adjustments, reforms, not in the typical IMF way, which will happen in any case, in my opinion. The IMF will come in and will create conditionality, and it will be very severe for the average Lebanese, but more so on the political side. And even, I would say, to the excellent question, that even Lebanese, if you ask them today, many of them do want this structural shift reform in the politics. So I would say without political reform, Lebanon will not be able to change, even if they get the aid and support eventually from the international community, which will be far more difficult to come in, and it will stay for a longer time waiting to see the changes than before.
Great, thank you. Another question is from Naman Haptam, who's a student here at Cambridge in the Faculty of History. And he has a very good question, I think, to both Ronan and Nikolai, which is whether there is a threshold whereby Russia might not longer tolerate continuous Turkish and Israeli incursions into Syria. And indeed, I was myself interested in this question of Israel and Russia coming together in Syria. So maybe we'll start with you, Nikolai. Do you think there is a point where Russia might sort of lash out to Turkey and Israel to, let's say, mark out its territory?
Well, I would certainly divide this question into two. One related to Russian-Israeli relations, and one is related to Russian-Turkish relations. Definitely, there are certain questions that are existing on each side to each other in Moscow and Jerusalem. But meanwhile, I would say that Israel is considered by Russia as a silent partner in the Middle East. So it is relations about which Russia is trying not to speak aloud, but that are carefully guarded by the Russian leadership, especially given that Putin is personally behind this idea of quite close relations with Israel, which, given that they are also built on the huge basis of pragmatism, creates quite a lot of flexibility in them. And honestly, if we look back at the history of these relations since Russian military intervention in in Syria, we will definitely see that in spite of certain critical moments that were emerging during these 5 years, Moscow and Israel, they managed to establish quite an effective deconfliction mechanism and the channels of communications that were allowing them to handle the bilateral misunderstanding challenges that were emerging. Not saying that Moscow sent a clear signal to Iran that Russia is ready to cooperate with Iran on the support of Assad regime and ensuring its survival, to the limits the Iranians are not using the territory of Syria against Israel. So as soon as such a challenge emerges, Russia is just stepping back, leaving it to Israel, to Tel Aviv and Tehran to handle this issue. On Turkey-Russian relations, I would say that we need to consider it in a broader sense and within the Russian-Turkish relations in Syria and in Libya. So from this point of view, definitely these relations, they are more tense. They are facing quite a lot of challenges, but for now, the positions of these two countries in Syria and in Libya build up in a way that these positions, they are not giving a predominant advantage to either of the sides. So if we take, for example, Syria, definitely militarily, Russian positions are more advantageous. And and I believe that one day we will see the resumption of bloodshed in Syria, the resumption of the regime offensive to the Idlib area. When it resumes, it will allow the regime, with the Russian support, of course, to gain a greater control. But at the same time, the very involvement of Turkey into the Idlib issue, it also creates a very strong political positions for the Ankara to ensure that its interests in this area are taken into account. And Moscow, at least for now, it clearly understands this and trying to avoid the creation of the situation when there will be a clash between the two countries, I mean, a direct military clash. Same could be applied to Libya. So for now, the stands of the two countries are created in a way that none of them can afford further advances. So I can hardly see the forces supported by Turkey advancing further to the east of Syria, whereas Russia is trying to encourage, I also don't see this happening, Russia trying to encourage Haftar forces to resume, if it of course can, its offensive operations against Tripoli.
Great, thank you. Ronan, do you want to also comment on Russia and Israel just quickly? And then I have another question for you, but let's just go for number one.
Well, I think that if 10 years ago, 8 years ago, someone would come to me and say that in 2020, there will be an encrypted phone line from the subterranean Canary headquarters of the Israeli Air Force to Khamimim Air Force, the General Command, Supreme Command of the Russian forces in Syria. And once an Israeli general of the Air Force picks up the phone, he will have a Russian general at the other side. Of course, usually the Israeli general doesn't speak Russian, but plenty of people speaking Russian around him, so they will be able to translate. And so I would say, no, there's no, like, this is insane. Nobody would ever dream that there will be such a strong and intensive coordination, at least on a tactical level, between both armies, in order to make sure that there's no military friction on air and on ground. The frequent visits of Prime Minister Netanyahu and his national security advisor, Chief of Mossad Yossi Cohen, to the Kremlin, the visits of Russian generals to Israel, the last visit of President Putin in Israel, which of course related to the Holocaust, but had also a political angle. All of that is remarkable. The fact that Israel has, at least on some levels, a much better relations with Russia than the Russian relations with the US, this is all almost inconceivable or unheard of. On the other hand, I think that while Benjamin Netanyahu was able to create that tactical level intensive coordination, and he was one of the few that believed that this is possible, he was less capable in convincing or making the Russian leadership, especially President Putin, to understand or to follow the Israeli sensitivities in the region. The Russians promised few times that they will make sure that the Iranian presence is going to be kept only around Damascus. This was never fulfilled. The Russians allowed Israel to bomb the Iranians in Syria and did not interfere with that so much as long as no Russian soldiers were killed. But they did not stop the Iranians, because at the end of the day, I would say the parallel interest of Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, and Russia prevail to those of Russia and Israel. And while this is just an assessment, I didn't hear that from Putin, though there are some Israelis who claim that they did. But though I'm not sure that President Putin likes the Iranians or President Assad or Hezbollah, but he believes that his central interest to maintain presence in the region, to have the port access, to have the Russian intelligence bases in Syria, and other Russian interests in Syria are well preserved with the current situation, preserving President Assad on his throne and having Hezbollah and Iran taking care of that. And so at the end of the day, if to make a sort of a balance, I would say that President Putin is more at the side of Israel adversaries than he is at the side of Israel, but he is, with no doubt, I think he has a great appreciation to Israel, to the use of force, to the resilience of Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu, and he shows that in his behavior.
Great, thank you. I'm going to combine two questions on Iran, also for you, Ronan. Basically, one by John Dunn from Policy here at Cambridge, and another one from Mehdi Askarieh, who's at Oxford and at the Kulam campus. And they both of them, in essence, sort of are about Iran and Israel. And I'm going to try to sort of combine them by asking, you describe this threat of a new northern war, and obviously a lot in the last few years has indicated some sort of escalation between Iran and Israel, potentially up to war. Is there a scenario, and are there forces both within Israel and maybe also both within Iran, which might actually move the two countries together for a more reconciliatory position, a sort of detente between the two countries? Because if they are, at least in Israel, I just wouldn't know of them. So I'd be interested in your view on this.
Well, look, Israel and Iran were engaged in a mostly clandestine, but a extensive, fruitful, multi-level and multi-realm relationship until the fall of the Shah in 1979. So, and both countries do have mutual interests. The Iranians do not see themselves as Arabs, and they are in bitter rivalry with some of their neighbors, especially Iraq. So they have, both countries have common interests. But once Khomeini took over, once the Islamic Republic was established, their foreign policy, their regional foreign policy, is in striking contradiction with Israel's. They see Hezbollah not just as a proxy, they're not just as a military militia or an army now that they are supporting in Lebanon. These are their brothers, and their brothers are in conflict with Israel. And so, in order to start a sort of a détente with Israel, they need to stop supporting their brothers. And I don't see this happening. And I don't see this this is happening, especially nowadays, with the rising power, more rising power of the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, which are, the gatekeepers of the regime, the custodians of the revolution at one hand, and also the main supporters of Hezbollah and other military proxies or militias in the area, which are also fighting Israel, like Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So, present time, I don't see any kind of reasonable likelihood that this will happen. On the contrary, I think that Israel has now came to believe that the efforts that were invested by both countries, the US and Israel, throughout the years for what they call the regime change, overt or clandestine, were all in vain. There's not going to be, according to I would say, strong analysis in Israel, there's not going to be a regime change in Iran. Therefore, those people believe the only way is to, I would say, coerce or force the current regime to follow the policy that would not endanger Israel, which is, at least the time being, everything that Iran is doing, according to the Israeli perception. So if there is a way, according to those Israeli officials, the way is to use force to, I would say, convince the current Iranian regime, which is not going to be replaced soon, to follow at least a few of the Secretary of State Pompeo points, mainly to stop the nuclear project and to stop any kind of support to these militias and proxies in the Middle East.
Thank you. Hesham, I wanted to pick up on something you said in your introduction. You talked about the European Union, and you said their ambition was to become a player, not just a payer. But maybe that's not quite the perception that you get on the ground these days from the European Union in the Middle East. I think they are often the ones who pay. And it's not quite clear what their impact is in many events. So I was wondering, from your perspective, what did the European Union need, or would the European Union need to become a more serious actor in the region? I mean, can it be one without, you know, refusing to take some hard power, you know, instruments into its foreign policy reservoir, or is it basically doomed to stay on the sidelines as long as it stays out of these sort of operations as well?
Well, the problem is related to the decision-making process in the European Union, or partly. For example, they are all against annexation. Can they agree on a course of action in order to prevent annexation? The answer is no. They all wanted to find a solution for Syria. They were not able to put pressure to bear in order to achieve progress in Syria. They were divided on Libya, and there were all kinds of differences between France and Italy and so on. So the divisions within the European Union, which is normal, makes it very difficult for them to be effective. So now Europe has to decide, how are they going to deal with issues that are of critical importance to Europe that does not command consensus between the 27? So I think that this is the major issue. Of course, Europe is important, and they realize that instability in our part of the world has huge implications and repercussions on the situation in Europe. You know, when we had a migration crisis in the last few years, you know, Europe turned into a crisis mode. And this was because of around 1.5 million refugees. While there are countries like Lebanon who had very similar figures of refugees coming to Lebanon from Syria and otherwise. Jordan also had huge numbers of refugees. This applies to Turkey as well, that has much more than these figures. So you cannot be effective without being able to work together in a manner that would send a unified message, or at least have a critical weight that is willing to push in a direction that would allow Europe to play a more effective role, particularly in relation to conflicts in the region, in relation to economic cooperation, you know, aspects of that nature. That's a different story, and it's much easier. But it is conflict where Europe has to get its act together.
Thank you. And another thing you mentioned in your introductory comments, and that's obviously going to be, that's sort of always the elephant in the room when you talk about foreign intervention in the Middle East, is America. I was just wondering, and that's something maybe the others might also want to comment on, what sort of difference in US approach to the Middle East might we see if a Biden administration was voted in November, as compared to what can we expect from another 4 years of Donald Trump in the region? Yeah.
Well, there are huge expectations in relation to what may happen if there is a change in administration as a result of elections in the United States. Of course, it remains to be seen, but there are positions that are known in relation to how Biden thinks about a number of issues, where he diametrically disagrees with what is happening today. Biden was part of the US administration when the nuclear deal was achieved. Biden had recently a clear position in relation to annexation, indicating that this is something that he will not support, and so on. So there are fundamental differences between the two approaches in relation to a number of elements in the Middle East. So there will be huge changes. We have to admit as well that more recently, a number of countries in the Gulf started to become rather concerned that they may not be able to rely on the US administration as much in dealing with the Iranian threat. Of course, this will probably continue if there is a Biden presidency and so on. So we will have to wait and see how things would evolve, but there will be huge implications as a result of a possible change of administration in the United States.
John, what is your take on this? Because obviously you have a lot of experience in dealing with Saudi Arabia in particular and the Gulf. How do you sort of see the issue from there?
Yeah, well, you know, at times, especially prior to elections, we tend to believe that the incoming president in the U.S. is going to be diametrically different in his approach to the Middle East, and then 6 months into his presidency, and then kind of same business as usual. The relationship is quite deep, not just in historic terms, but also technology, military, and all that. The foreign economic assistance, the trade ties, they're very important. So I don't think the US is going to disconnect. Of course, there are elements of an earthquake taking place here and there. You have the remnants of Russia coming in, you have the Chinese, and often enough we believe that this is going to shake the Middle East and suddenly the US is going to exit. US does not necessarily need to be involved by having troops in the Middle East. They can do it without troops. Just the omnipresence of US companies in the Middle East, look at the Gulf, is enough to indicate that I don't think the US is going to go anywhere. Now, will it have a difference of approach in terms of the Iranian approach, the annexation? Probably, yes, I think that you will have, but it's not going to suddenly disappear and say that we no longer need the Middle East because we have shale oil. On the contrary, I think this is the time when they need oil and they need Saudi Arabia. Will the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the US change? Well, you know, there are so many people believing that suddenly if Biden arrives, the cozy relationship between, let's say, MBS and Trump is going to disappear and suddenly they will open the files. I don't think this is going to happen. Realpolitik will step in, and come November and December, people will begin to see how differently politicians behave when they worry about their seats and their incumbency. So that's really what I think. The other thing is something that Hisham said, which is very important, and I just wanted to highlight it. It has to do very much with this EU-Middle East relationship. And in many ways, the EU has a difficulty of having a coordinated approach because its structure is lacking in coordination when it comes to foreign policy. And especially when it comes to putting teeth behind that foreign policy on the defense element. However, the EU and the Europeans have to quickly realize that they will have millions and millions of Arabs and others from sub-Saharan Africa invading or occupying, or whatever you want to say, their countries because of lack of development as an opportunity. And if I may say so, this could also happen in some ways in Israel. What was said before about 10 years ago of what we thought and what is happening today could happen on the issue of migration. Millions of Jordanians could just walk over and go to Israel. We thought that this is impossible for people to go to Turkey and then they just cross over and they go to Greece or from Libya into Italy and so forth. So even from a security standpoint, Israel is not necessarily secure, if I may add. Thank you.
Thanks, and you managed to get Ronan back on video with your statement. Well done. I just actually have a quick.
I really apologize. It's just that this really something big happening now, and I have.
No, but sure, I thought that, but I thought it was.
We are reporting live on the online of the New York Times, so I have to I have to be in touch with some sources.
No worries. John, just a very quick follow-up. Do you think that now with the sort of drop in oil prices, etc., this very, let's say, aggressive Saudi foreign policy in the last 5 years, a very outgoing and confrontational approach, is that going to decrease in the next few years? Could there be a shift in approach?
So first of all, I don't think that it is aggressive. I think the old approach was not at all really something that one can define as foreign policy. It was a foreign policy of staying on the sidelines in this modest foreign policy that was exhibited for decades on end. No, I think that Saudi Arabia will be more outgoing, will be more forthcoming, and it needs to be. It needs to gain back its role in the region, given that it is the most important economy in the Middle East. It is a G20 economy, the only one that is, let's say, representing the Arab world. It's an $800 billion size economy. So I think its relations with the outside world will continue to be more outward going. I wouldn't say aggressive, because Saudi Arabia comes out of 50 years of modest foreign policy, or if I would say hibernation.
Ronan, just a very quick question, because we're coming to the end of the program, but one thing you said, which I thought was very interesting, did actually also relate to the European Union. And just to follow up, you said, because I followed the news very clearly on Germany and the question of annexation, and the Germans were very clear that they didn't like it, but they also were very clear that they would not take any sanctions, that they would take, they were very modest in the consequences of this. And so I was quite surprised when you pointed out German position and European position in Israel as an important issue for Netanyahu. So what is the leverage, do you think, or what would you say?
Well, it's not just what Heiko Maas, the German foreign minister, has said when he came to Israel, and it's not just, of course, Germany would not adopt sanctions against Israel because of the German commitment to Israel, but the European Union did threaten and some of its members to execute the sanctions against Israel. It's not just that, it's a part of a package of the international and domestic reactions to the possibility of annexation, and especially, of course, the fact that Israel was not green-lighted now to go ahead, and we hear about some kind of even severe arguments inside the American administration between Kushner on one hand, who is pressured by his friends in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, of course, and the UAE, and other elements like Mr. Friedman, the American ambassador to Israel, who is, I think, more right-wing than the settlers in Israel. In his, so he's by far more hawkish than Netanyahu, and he is sort of bypassing Netanyahu from his right and pressuring him to do something that his administration is apparently not fully in confirmation with. So I think this is all together, especially, of course, what comes from Washington, this sort of chilling wind. And you know, I just saw that there's a new op-ed by Israel Today, Israel Hayom, the daily paper owned by Sheldon Adelson, the avid supporter of Netanyahu, who now says, his political correspondent says that Netanyahu has the moral right to do so, and portray Jared Kushner as the bad guy. So now Jared Kushner becomes the bad guy when he does not follow any kind of policy, right-wing policy that the Israeli government would like to deploy. I just want to say one thing, that I think that it also crossed another line, or that last red line, if there are still red lines, at Benny Gantz, the other leader, the political leader in Israel, who competed against Netanyahu, then joined his government. But I think that was the last thing that pushed him to the wall, and he said to Netanyahu, enough is enough. And therefore, we did not see annexation in the last few days, and I'm not sure that we are going to see it in the next few months.
Great, thank you very much. And I think we're basically coming to the end of this webinar. It is pretty much exactly 6 o'clock, and that's coming to the end of our hour. We have covered a lot of ground, really, and I think it is really fascinating to talk about these broad trends in the region and these different actors. I think, if anything, we can see more like this current trend, that's this more indirect approach of interventionism, holding ground by Russia in Syria, or by Israel in the same area. That's probably going to continue, and of course, if your economic predictions are correct, John, then we're going to see much more talk about economic crisis also happening in the next few years in the region. But that means basically that we just have to keep continuing having these conversations. So there's some silver lining there. It has been fascinating. It's been a real pleasure to chair this panel. I just want to say thank you to the audience for joining, and thanks a lot to our 4 panelists, to Nikolai Kozanov, to Hesham Youssef, John Swakianakis, and Ronan Bergman for taking the time and being with us tonight. And as announced at the beginning, you can find the video of this event on our website over the next few days. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you at our next event, whenever that may be. Bye.